We're not taught how to think. We're taught what to think, but no one really teaches us how to think. So it begs the question, how does one think? How does one discern this realm and look for any degree of truth? We have certain tools, principles, foundational principles that have been established throughout humanity. Principles like logic, reasoning, critical thinking, the principles of objectivity, the empirical method, evidence-based practices. There's ways that we can at least attain some degree of truth, or at least approach it. And I think the principles of logic are primary amongst these. So I want to approach the concept of logical fallacies with you all. This is called Logical Fallacies, a hand list. Let's begin. Fallacies are statements that might sound reasonable or superficially true, but are actually flawed and dishonest. It is important to avoid them in your own arguments, and it is also important to be able to spot them in others' arguments so a false line of reasoning won't fool you. Think of this as intellectual kung fu, the virtual art of self-defense in a debate. For extra impact, learn both the Latin terms, okay, etc., etc. In general, one useful way to organize fallacies is by category. We have below the following categories: fallacies of relevance, component fallacies, fallacies of ambiguity, and fallacies of omission. We will discuss each type in turn. Fallacies of relevance. These fallacies appeal to evidence or examples that are not relevant to the argument. The first fallacy of relevance is called appeal to force, also called an argumentum ad baculum, or the might makes it right fallacy. This argument uses force or threat of force or some other unpleasant backlash to make the audience accept the conclusion. It commonly appears as the last resort when evidence or rational arguments fail to convince a reader. If the debate is about whether or not 2 + 2 is 4, an opponent's argument that he will smash your nose in if you don't agree with his claim doesn't change the truth of the issue. Logically, this consideration has nothing to do with the points under consideration. Let's go to the next one. Genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is the claim that an idea, product, or a person must be untrustworthy because of its racial, geographic, or ethnic origin. That car can't possibly be any good. It was made in Japan. You can't just point to somebody's heritage and say that disqualifies them from the argument. It doesn't work that way. Let's go to the next fallacy under the heading of relevance. A personal attack. This one's called an argumentum ad hominem, also called poisoning the well. This is when you're attacking or praising the people who make the argument rather than discussing the argument itself. And there appears to be 2 types under this one. There's the abusive and the circumstantial. We don't need to get into the nitty-gritty with the personal attack, but let's just make it be known that if you just attack somebody, it really doesn't go against their argument, and it makes you look really bad. Let's keep going. Argumentum ad popularum. Literally, argument to the people. Using an appeal to popular assent, often by arousing the feelings and enthusiasm of the multitude rather than building an argument. It is the favorite device with the propagandist, the demagogue, and the advertiser. An example of this type of argument is Shakespeare's version of Mark Antony's funeral oration for Julius Caesar. There's 3 basic approaches to the ad popularum. There's the bandwagon approach, the patriotic approach, the snob approach. The bandwagon approach is everybody's doing it. The patriotic approach is basically draping oneself in flag. You see this one a lot, guys. Nationalism, hashtag MAGA, make America great again. And there's apparently this snob approach, where you're just saying, everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing it. Oh, everybody's taking the clot shot, Z. Don't be weird. Just line up and get injected. Just change your genetics from the fundamental way. Yeah, everybody's doing it. So what? They're turning everyone into transhumanist fucking abominations to creation. Yeah. In all three of these examples, their rhetoric does not supply evidence that the argument is true. It merely makes assertions that people who agree or disagree with the argument. Exactly. This next one, appeal to tradition. Kind of the same thing. This line of thought asserts that a premise must be true because people have always believed or done it, right? Just like people have always known it's a globe. Well, not always, but for 2,000 years, all the way back to the ancient Greeks, they knew it was a globe. They saw a bubble. One day, somebody blew a bubble. Yeah, I'm sure they had bubbles in ancient Greece somehow. And they were like, look, a bubble. It's perfectly spherical. That means we live on a sphere because a bubble exists. Yeah, that's it. Right? I remember when they saw that two obelisks at a distance had different angles to their shadow, and they were like, oh, globe. So basically just say we've known for thousands of years, dummy, that it's a globe. It just is. Like it says. It asserts that the premise must be true because people have always believed in it or done it. The next one, appeal to improper authority. An appeal to an improper authority, such as a famous person or source that may not be reliable or who might not know anything about the topic. This fallacy attempts to capitalize upon the feelings of respect and familiarity with the famous individual, like Bill Nye, the science guy, or the lion guy with the bow tie. He's got a white coat on, and he's a science guy. He's certainly not an actor. So let's just appeal to whatever the fuck he says. Yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson. He tells me that, of course, the Earth is a sphere. Oh, well, not a total sphere. It's an oblate spheroid. Let's continue. Appeal to emotion. An emotional appeal concerning what should be a logical issue during a debate. While pathos generally works to reinforce a reader's sense of duty and outrage at some abuse, if a writer tries to use emotion merely for the sake of getting the reader to accept what should be a logical conclusion, the argument is a fallacy. Because just because somebody says, don't you care about my grandma? My grandma has diabetes. If you don't take the clot shot, you're going to kill grandma. That's an appeal to emotion. Don't you love your grandma? How dare you? Take the clot shot. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't make the clot shot safe or effective or even any form of treatment. It lends nothing to its efficacy. But just take it, because if not, you're a murderer. Let's keep going. Argument for adverse consequences. Asserting that an argument must be false because the implications of it being true was cause negative results. Just like the flat earth argument must be false because the implications would be so negative that I just can't fucking handle it. That my little feelers and my little sensibilities and my cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias just can't let me understand the magnitude of the lie. Because it must be a globe. Because if it's flat, I'd have to realize that really, there's really no such thing as nation states that are autonomous. There's really no such thing of geopolitical conflict, and that all wars are made up, and it's really just a new world order that's actually an old world order that's kind of just running the whole show. Yeah. That's called an argument from adverse consequences. So when I'm trying to tell you that there's no proof of a fucking globe or convexity or movement whatsoever, and you just keep over and over and over and over and over, just keep telling me that it has to be a globe because if not, it would just be too fucked up. That's a logical fallacy called an argument from adverse consequences. Yeah, just because it would be really, 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 really fucked up to realize that there's no globe doesn't make it a globe. Argument from personal incredulity. Asserting that an opponent's argument must be false because you personally don't understand it or can't follow its technicalities. For instance, one person might assert, I don't understand that engineers' argument about how airplanes can fly. Therefore, I can't believe that airplanes are able to fly. Component fallacies. Component fallacies are errors in inductive and deductive reasoning, or in syllogistic terms that fail to overlap. The first one is the begging the question, also called the Pareto principle. This term is sometimes used interchangeably with circular reasoning. If writers assume as evidence for their argument the very conclusion they are attempting to prove, they engage in the fallacy of begging the question. The most common form of this fallacy is when the first claim is initially loaded with the very conclusion one has yet to prove. I'll give you a for instance. When people are basically trying to prove the globe by referencing gravity and refraction. Well, of course it's a globe. Well, why is it a globe? Because of gravity. No, there's no proof of gravity. You can't just claim gravity, which implies a globe, when you're trying to prove a globe. You can't just claim refraction when you're trying to prove convexity. You can't do it because by saying refraction, you're implying convexity. Do you understand, guys? It's begging the question. If you're trying to prove your dumb globe, you can't just assume the globe in the proof. Get it? Next one. Circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is closely related to begging the question. Often the writers using this fallacy would take one idea and phrase it in two statements. The assertions differ sufficiently to obscure the fact that the same proposition occurs as both a premise and a conclusion. The speaker or author then tries to prove his or her assertion by merely repeating it in different words. So-and-so wrote in Elements of Logic, to allow every man unbounded freedom of speech must always be, on the whole, advantageous to the state. For it is highly conducive to the interest of the community that each individual should enjoy a liberty perfectly unlimited of expressing his sentiments. Obviously, the premise is not logically irrelevant to the conclusion. For if the premise is true, the conclusion must also be true. However, it is logically irrelevant in proving the conclusion. You can't try to prove the statement within the conclusion. Here's an example of circular reasoning. This is a good one it gives. It says God exists. Why should I believe that? Because the Bible says God exists. Why should I believe anything the Bible says? Because the Bible is the inspired word of God. Therefore, God exists. Let's move on to the next one. Hasty generalization, also called jumping to conclusions. A hasty generalization, mistaken use of inductive reasoning when there are too few samples to prove a point. Here's an example. Susan failed Biology 101. Herman failed Biology 101. Ebert failed Biology 101. I therefore conclude that most students who take Biology 101 will fail it. In understanding and categorizing general situation, a logician cannot normally examine every single example. However, the examples used in inductive reasoning should be typical of the problem or situation at hand. Maybe Susan, Herman, and Ebert are exceptionally poor students. Maybe they were sick and missed too many lectures. Hasty generalization. You can't just take a few isolated examples that just so happen to prove your point and make that the general, the whole. It doesn't work like that. And then they're saying there's types of hasty generalizations. One is called a fallacy of accident. The other is called a misleading statistic. The next logical fallacy under the component fallacy heading is the false cause. This fallacy establishes a cause and effect relationship that doesn't exist. And there are two types. There's the non-causa pro causa, which literally means not the cause for a cause. And there's the post hoc ergo propter hoc. Literally means after this, therefore, before this. Correlation is not causality. I'll give you an example. Humans produce carbon dioxide and methane due to human technology and civilization. Cars, travel, energy, greenhouse gases, large-scale agro-farming, large-scale animal domestication, methane, cow farts, everybody. Methane from all the rice fields and soy fields. Humans produce greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases cause global warming. Therefore, global warming is caused by humans. We don't know that. There's a lot of reasons for the climate change that we seem to be observing. Correlation is not causality. Here's the next one. Irrelevant conclusions. This fallacy occurs when the rhetorician adopts an argument purporting to establish a particular conclusion that directs it to prove a different conclusion. For example, when a particular proposal for housing legislation is under construction, a legislator may argue that decent housing for all people is desirable. Everyone presumably will agree. However, the question at hand concerns a particular measure. The question really isn't, is it good to have decent housing? The question really is, will this particular measure actually provide it, or is there a better alternative? And there's types of relevant conclusions. One of the most common, apparently, is a red herring. A red herring is a deliberate attempt to change the subject or divert the argument from the real question at issue to some side point. Another example of the red herring is the fallacy known as a tu quo quo, Latin for "and you too," which asserts that the advice or argument must be false simply because the person presenting the advice doesn't consistently follow it herself. Let's continue. The straw man argument. Apparently, it's a subtype of the red herring. This fallacy includes any lame attempt to prove an argument by overstating, exaggerating, or oversimplifying the arguments of the opposing side. Such approach is building a straw man argument. Think about it. It's like when I say to people, hey guys, the globe's a lie. And they say, you're an idiot. All right, well, if the Earth's flat, where's the edge? How come nobody ever fell off the edge? Oh, well, how could the Earth be flat if all the other planets are round? Not even knowing that round and spherical are two different things. Not even realizing that they're basically building a straw man argument. It's basically they're trying to create a straw man of what a flat earther is that they build and then burn down. Because I never said anything about a disc floating in space that you can fall off of. I never said anything about other planets because I know Earth is not a planet. Earth is Earth. The planets are the planets. But what these anti-flat earthers are going to do, they're going to build a straw man argument. They're going to tell you what you believe. They're going to tell Z what he believes about this realm and then burn it down. That's a straw man. The next one is a non sequitur. Literally means it does not follow. A non sequitur is any argument that does not follow from the previous statement. Usually what happens is the writer leaps from A to B and then jumps to D, leaving out C of the argument. Anyway, let me continue. The slippery slope fallacy is a non sequitur fallacy in which the speaker argues that once the first step is undertaken, a second or third step will inevitably follow. However, this sort of thinking does not allow for any possibility of stopping the process. It simply assumes that, once it's started, there's no stopping. The next one's called the either-or fallacy, also called the black and white fallacy, the false dilemma, or false dichotomy. This fallacy occurs when a writer builds an argument upon the assumption that there are only two choices or possible outcomes, when actually there are several. Outcomes are seldom so simple. This fallacy most frequently appears in connection with sweeping generalizations. The undistributed middle term. A specific type of error in deductive reasoning in which the minor premise and the major premise of the syllogism might or might not overlap. The next one's called a contradictory premises, also known as the logical paradox, establishing a premise in such a way that it contradicts another earlier premise. For instance, if God can do anything, he can make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it. The first premise establishes a deity that has the irresistible capacity to move another object. The second premise establishes the immovable object impervious to any movement. If the first object capable of moving anything exists, by definition, the immovable object cannot exist, and vice versa. And closely related is the fallacy of special pleading, in which the writer creates a universal principle, then insists that the principle does not, for some reason, apply to the issue at hand. Now let's talk about fallacies of ambiguity. These errors occur with ambiguous words or phrases, with meanings, the meanings of which shift and change in the course of discussion. Such more or less subtle changes can render arguments fallacious. It's kind of like moving the goalposts right in the middle of a conversation, which makes sense because we need to use words and phrases to speak. We have common understandings with words and phrases. It gives us a framework through which to communicate. Well, as such, if those meanings and words start to shift and change over the course of discussion, it could probably lead to some problems. The first fallacy of ambiguity is equivocation. Using a word in a different way than the author used it, or the speaker, in the original premise, or changing definitions halfway through a discussion. When we use the same word or phrase in different senses within one line of argument, we commit the fallacy of equivocation. Consider this example. Plato says the end of a thing is its perfection. I say that death is the end of life. Hence, death is the perfection of life. Here, the word end means goal in Plato's message, but it means last event or termination in the author's second uses, because you're equivocating a word when it was obviously used in two different contexts. Here's the next one. Amphiboly, from the Greek word indeterminate. This logical fallacy is similar to equivocation. Here, the ambiguity results from grammatical construction. A statement may be true according to one interpretation of how each word functions in a sentence and false according to another. When a premise works with an interpretation that is true, but the conclusion uses the secondary false interpretation, we have a fallacy of amphiboly. In the comment, save soap and waste paper, the amphibolous use of waste results in the problem of determining whether waste functions as a verb or an adjective. It's basically saying that this fallacy results from the grammatical construction. Let's move on. Composition. This logical fallacy is the result of reasoning from the properties of the parts of the whole to the properties of the whole itself. It is an inductive error. Such an argument might hold that because every individual part of a large tractor is lightweight, the entire machine also must be lightweight. This fallacy is similar to a hasty generalization, but it focuses on parts of a single whole rather than using too few examples to create a categorical generalization. Let's continue. Division. This logical fallacy is the reverse of composition. It is the misapplication of deductive reasoning. One fallacy of division argues falsely that what is true of the whole must be true of the individual parts. Such an argument notes that Microtech is a company with great influence in the California legislature. Ebert Smith works at Microtech. He must have a great influence in the California legislature. Again, it's a misapplication of deductive reasoning. And you can see where the components of this one can be used for exploitation and propaganda. I want to show you how to reverse engineer their tactics, because I believe that these fallacies of logic are the very fundamentals that are employed to program, condition, and indoctrinate the entire civilization and men and women. So if we can learn their tactics and reverse engineer them, we then become less susceptible to their tactics. This is a huge one here. These misapplications in deductive reasoning, and this one in division makes perfect sense to me. Our final fallacy of ambiguity is the fallacy of reification, also called a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. The fallacy of treating a word or an idea as equivalent to the actual thing represented by the word or idea, or the fallacy of treating an abstraction or a process as equivalent to the concrete object or thing, or to a concrete object or thing. The fallacy of reification, the biggest one probably in the history of everything, is Einstein's theory of general relativity, his 1915 theory of general relativity. That asserts the bending and warping of space-time. Thus, the modern concept of gravity. You guys have to understand, #science defines gravity not by the attraction of two masses, mass attracting mass. They define it as Einstein's general theory of relativity, which is the bending and warping of space-time. To me, that is the ultimate example in science of a reification fallacy. Because, as it says, this fallacy is when you're treating a word or an idea as equivalent to an actual thing, or treating an abstraction or a process as equivalent to a concrete object or thing. Here's the point. If you're going to say gravity is the bending and warping of space-time, you have to understand that space and time are abstractions. They're concepts. Space and time are not concrete objects or things. Show me space, show me time. Can you touch space? Can you touch time? No. Therefore, it's not a concrete object or thing. It's an abstraction. So saying that you can bend and warp an abstraction is the ultimate example of a fallacy of reification. But yet, we decide the most fundamental concept of this reality, this gravity, even the whole quantum realm. You can even say that the very theories, the theoretical physics that this realm that science accepts as the underpinnings of this realm, fall under this fallacy of reification. Because just to say that particles are attracted to each other because of a force of gravity, or a force called strong nuclear force or weak nuclear force, is a fallacy of reification, because there's no proof of it. You know why? Because you can't prove it. You can't prove it because you can't observe, test, and repeat experiments on an abstraction. It's a concept. These are the things that people like myself are trying to scream at the very top of our lungs to any man or woman that will listen, is that the very foundational theoretical physics presented by #science through this co-opted academia and this quote-unquote Rockefeller-funded education system is founded on one of these primary logical fallacies. It's not real because it can't be proven to be real. And a theory will always be a theory until it's proven. And a law will always be a law till it's disproven. Just because when I drop something it falls to the ground, it doesn't mean that it was being pulled there by the bending and warping of space-time, and to think anything different to me is incredible. Fallacies of omission. These errors occur because the logician leaves out necessary material in an argument or misdirects others from missing information. It's basically like, yeah, I'm going to tell you like this part of this story, but not everything. Let's start with the first one. Stacking the deck. In this logical fallacy, the speaker stacks the deck in her favor, or his, by ignoring examples that disprove the point and listing only those examples that support his or her case. It's often like pretty convenient when one does this. They're just going to list everything that kind of makes their point, even though they may like recognize all these other examples that actually disprove the point. They're going to just conveniently leave those out of the conversation because those people really aren't interested in truth or the facts. They're just interested in proving their point, probably because they have an agenda that they're espousing. This fallacy is closely related to hasty generalization, but the term usually implies deliberate deception rather than an accidental logical error. They know about those other points that go against their argument. They're just going to conveniently leave those out and hope you don't notice. Let's continue with the next fallacy of omission. The not true Scotsman fallacy. This one, attempting to stack the deck specifically by defining terms in such a narrow or unrealistic manner as to exclude or omit relevant examples from a sample. For instance, suppose speaker 1 asserts the Scottish national character is brave and patriotic. No Scottish soldier has ever fled the field of battle in the face of the enemy. Like, I've seen Braveheart. Those guys didn't run away. Braveheart came, and he made his speech, and they all charged. Anyway, let me continue. Speaker number 2 objects. But what about Lucas Mick Scottish Falk? He fled from German troops in World War I. Speaker 1 retorts, well, obviously he doesn't count as a true Scotsman because he did not live up to Scottish ideals. Thus, he forfeited his Scotch identity. By this fallacious reasoning, any individual who would serve as evidence contradicting the first speaker's assertion is conveniently and automatically dismissed from consideration. Let's continue. The next fallacy of omission here on the list is the argument from the negative. Arguing from the negative asserts that since one position is untenable, the opposite stance must be true. This fallacy is often used interchangeably with argumentum ad ignorantium. We studied that one before. And the either-or fallacy listed above. We studied that before too. Keeping this in mind, students should remember that arguments from the negative are bad. Arguments from the positive must automatically be good. The basic here is is that since one position is unattainable, the opposite must be true. Exactly. And that's a fallacy. Because it's basically a false dichotomy. Let's continue. An appeal to a lack of evidence. Appealing to a lack of information to prove a point, or arguing that since the opposition cannot disprove a claim, the opposite stance must be true. An example of such an argument is the assertion that ghosts must exist because no one has been able to prove that they do not exist. Logicians know this is a logical fallacy because no competing argument has yet revealed itself. I always say this about the globe. I'm under no obligation to disprove your globe claim. I didn't make the claim. It's not my claim. You claimed the globe. You need to prove it. Just because somebody in opposition can't disprove it doesn't mean the opposite stance is true. The next one. Hypothesis contrary to fact, also called an argumentum ad speculum. Trying to prove something in the real world by using imaginary examples alone, or asserting that if hypothetically X had occurred, Why would have been the result? An argument that says if Monet had been trained as a butcher rather than going to college, the Impressionistic movement would have never influenced modern art. Such hypotheses are misleading lines of argument because it is often possible that some other individual would have solved the issue. It's like saying that, like, oh, if Bill Gates never existed, you'd never have a computer. You'd probably still have a computer. Get it? And the last logical fallacy here, under the fallacy of omission category, is the complex question, also called the loaded question. Phrasing a question or statement in such a way as to imply another unproven statement is true without evidence or discussion. This fallacy often overlaps with begging the question, since it also presupposes a definite answer to a previous unstated question. For instance, if I were to ask you, have you stopped taking drugs yet? My hidden suspicion is that you have been taking drugs. Right, it's a loaded question. Such a question cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. It is not a simple question, but consists of several questions rolled into one. There's implications within the question. In the case, the unstated question is, have you taken drugs in the past? Followed by, if you have taken drugs in the past, have you stopped taking them now? In cross-examination, a lawyer might ask a flustered witness, where did you hide the evidence? You see this employed in that type of environment consistently. Or, when did you stop beating your wife? Intelligent procedure when faced with such a question is to analyze its component parts. If one answers or discusses the prior implicit question first, the explicit question may dissolve. Right, there's an implicit question within the explicit question. Guys,